The second Italian dreadnought battleship, Conte di Cavour, henceforth shortened to just Cavour, was a fairly substantial departure from the previous battleship. Where Dante had been a ship with no superfiring turrets, Cavour would be a more traditional early dreadnought, with superfiring guns and an amidships turret to support them. She was fairly small and lightly armored even by those standards, though, and in another world would probably have been scrapped sometime in the 1920s or 1930s at the latest. That would not end up happening. Italy would, instead, put her and her surviving sister through one of the most extensive rebuilds of any warship, surpassed only by the rebuilds of the Andrea Doria class that followed them, in ships such as Victorious and other navies. This rebuild would take an obsolete ship and turn her into, well, still an arguably outdated ship, but at least one capable of fighting older French battleships head-on. Of course, before we can talk about that rebuild, it is prudent to talk about her design and history. Conte di Cavour was initially envisioned as a repeat of Dante Alighieri, and not a new ship. She was initially ordered in July 1908, a full year before Dante was even laid down. This was, admittedly, jumping the gun a bit on the part of Italy, as they would later find out. For while their first dreadnought would only enter service in 1913, well after the launching of her successors, it was already apparent that there were certain problems with her design, namely in that her ability to fire on either end, bow or stern, was inherently limited by her turret layout. It was this limitation that, largely, led to the design of the Cavour class. They came about due to a desire to increase fire on either end of the ship, in addition to better broadside angles. The simplest way to do this, of course, was to move the guns into superfiring pairs. However, the Italian Navy and their budget did not allow for a radical increase in size of the battleships, and the Regia Marina had no desire to sacrifice overall firepower, or, for that matter, speed and armor. As such, if the Cavour class was to be as capable as Dante, it was necessary to retain the same number and caliber of guns. It would have required unacceptable compromises in design to simply take the 4 triple turrets of the earlier battleship and make them into superfiring pairs. The same was true for the increase in size needed to have the same capabilities, while still gaining the superfiring turrets. The resulting compromise, then, would be similar to that of Nevada over in the United States. A twin turret mounted superfiring over a triple turret. In so doing, Cavour could mount 10 guns in 2 pairs, one set on the bow and one on the stern. This was still a decrease in overall firepower, though, so where these Italian ships differ from the first standard is in having a 5th turret, a triple, mounted amidships. This allowed for an increase in firepower over Dante, albeit of only 1 gun in absolute terms. In practical terms, their gun layout was certainly an improvement. The rest of the design flows out from there, really. The ships had to be built longer and finer in order to maintain something resembling the same speed, though a slight loss was to be expected. As the ships were longer, so too was the armor belt, which led to an increase in displacement in addition to the extra turret weight. This was necessary as the battleships were to maintain a similar level of protection to Dante on a larger ship. With the design worked out, 3 battleships were ordered for the class in 1909, or in the case of Cavour herself, reordered. These 3 ships, Conte di Cavour, Giulio Cesare, and Leonardo da Vinci, were ordered as a direct response to the French construction of the Corbeil class, and, one supposes, the Austrians building their own dreadnoughts. Laid down in 1910, albeit all 3 in different months, the dreadnoughts would similarly all be launched in 1911. Cavour was the first, exactly a year after she was laid down, entering the water on August 10, 1911. Her sisters would follow within a day of each other, with Da Vinci on October 14th and Cesare on October 15th. It is here where the ships begin to diverge. There were issues with procuring both armor plates and their main battery. The former, as Italian industry struggled a bit with both importing materials and putting them together. The latter, as the Italians had to build the guns themselves or import them from Britain. Even the guns built in Italy were built with British assistance. Such were the delays from this, as well as other things like the Italian war with Turkey in 1911, that the sisters would all finish well behind schedule. Cesare and Da Vinci would both commission in May 1914, while Cavour would only enter service on April 1st, 1915. And even then, she had to steal guns from the under construction Andrea Doria to do so. When she entered service, Cavour did so armed with her reappropriated guns. 13 of them, 12 inches, 305mm in caliber, mounted in 5 turrets. The previously mentioned pair of super-firing turrets on either end of the ship, and the single turret mounted amidships. These were joined by 18 4.7-inch secondary guns in casement mountings, and a further 14 3-inch guns. Rounding it out were the obligatory torpedo tubes, in this case 3 of the somewhat unusual size of 17.7 inches. All of this on a hull that could get to 21.5 knots, with an armor belt of 9.8 inches, 250mm at the thickest. Deck armor was practically non-existent, no thicker than 1.6 inches. With that out of the way, when it comes to service history, I'm only going to cover Cavour in detail here. Leonardo da Vinci's service was short, to say the least, and the history of that and her salvage operation is already covered in another video on the channel. Cesare, meanwhile, will also receive a video of her own at a later date. As for Cavour, well, as you'll notice, she entered service midway through the Great War. You'll also notice that you've probably never heard of any big Italy versus Austria smackdown during that war, at least at sea. Yeah, there's a reason for that. The Italian battle fleet, barring gunnery training, largely stayed in port for the entire course of World War I. Cavour is no exception here. While ostensibly a flagship, she remained in port and only rarely set sail. This was due to an abundance of caution on the Italian side. The Adriatic is a place where it would be very easy for light forces to ambush a battleship. Toss in the fact that Italy was so low on coal that they were sometimes raiding the Navy's stock just to keep factories running. Yeah, Cavour doesn't have much to talk about here. Sadly, the same could be said for the interwar period. She visited the United States and Halifax in 1919, but then went into reserve because of a shortage of crewmen. The 2 surviving Cavour sisters, da Vinci having sank in port during the Great War, bombarded Corfu in 1923. Following that, she didn't do much of note before being put into reserve on and off for the rest of the decade. She would remain as such, in fact, until 1933, when she began her major reconstruction. That is a meaty topic to get into, so the Cliff Notes version of it here. When the French laid down their new, small battleship Dunkirk in 1932, this prompted a response from the Italians. The French ship had been designed against the German Panzerschiff, and not at all against Italian ships. However, in that eternal Franco-Italian rivalry, a response became necessary. At first, the Italians watched and waited. After processing that, yes, the French were going through with this, Italy started looking for a counter. While the initial desire might have been for a new-build battleship, this concept soon got rejected. Instead, the Italians looked towards modernizing their existing battleships. This was, admittedly, out of a recognition that the 4 dreadnoughts were quickly becoming outdated, and in an era of trying to at least pay lip service to the treaty system, it was far less inflammatory, and less costly, to respond to Dunkirk by modernizing the existing battleships. The Cavours, as the older pair, were chosen first. And that modernization, as it turned out, ended up being a rebuild. A famous rebuild for just how much went into it. First and foremost, in the interest of increasing speed, the amidships turret was removed, and an entirely new power plant shoved into the ships. This increase in power, coupled with building a new bow directly over the old one, completely changed how the ships looked. What had been a fairly standard early dreadnought took on a look, along with the new superstructure, of a much more modern warship. A classically Italian kind of ship beauty, really. This did, in the end, allow the ships to get up to something like 27 knots in speed. That's a 6-knot improvement, which is not at all something to sneeze at. Further changes came to the main battery, which in addition to losing a turret, changed in caliber. The old guns were bored out and reworked to be 12.6 320mm guns. This increased their firepower, insofar as they could now heft heavier shells into the air. However, it did have some undesirable results on accuracy, though these often get overplayed. The secondary battery, then, was completely ripped out. The casements were removed and replaced by turreted guns, specifically 6 twin mounts of 120mm guns for surface action. These were joined by 4 twin mounts of 100mm guns for anti-aircraft duties, and a smattering of smaller weapons for the same role. The torpedo tubes were removed entirely. Armor protection was also improved. The main belt didn't get any modifications done to it, as that would have required an even more substantial rebuild. Instead, the deck armor was drastically increased to a maximum of 6 inches. This sounds more impressive than it is, as this armor was mounted in a set of different plates, which made it less effective than a single plate of the same thickness. Still, it was better than functionally nothing. The biggest change in protection was certainly the addition of a new anti-torpedo system. The Puglisi system, I probably butchered that, a large cylinder surrounded by water or oil. This system was a uniquely Italian take on how to lessen damage from torpedoes, and involved the cylinder absorbing the blast by crumpling in and keeping it from damaging the hull. The actual effectiveness of the system is debated. In any case, this massive rebuild ended in 1937. When Cavour entered back into proper service, she did so not as a new ship, but certainly a more capable one. She was still inferior in all respects to more modern battleships other than speed, but for the late 1930s, she certainly wasn't bad. Not as capable as, say, Queen Elizabeth, but fully capable of fighting the French, who were Italy's intended target for such a modernization. Unfortunately for the Italians, that would not come to pass. Her enemy would end up being Britain, a far more dangerous one, be it on the surface or in the air. Before that, of course, was the remainder of the 1930s. This was, in line with most navies, not exactly a time of great excitement. Cavour would spend it on various training missions or port visits, with a couple breaks here and there. She, along with a good chunk of the Regia Marina, took a position to block any attempt by the Spanish Republican fleet to flee to the Soviet Union. That was at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and came to nothing as no such attempt at flight happened. Following that, she would support the Italian occupation of Albania, which didn't exactly involve much sea combat. It was only when World War II kicked off that the Italian battle fleet would finally get the chance to use their now aging ships. For better or worse. Certainly for the worst, at least at first. Following engagements between light forces that didn't involve Cavour, she would get her first taste of combat at the Battle of Calabria on July 9, 1940. Here she served alongside her sister, Cesare, in an engagement with the British Mediterranean Fleet. This originated from convoy escorts on both sides, the two fleets being brought to battle by Admiral Cunningham in an attempt to block the Italians from Taranto. This was, largely, a long-range affair. The British and Italian battleships traded fire at extreme ranges, while the cruisers fought closer to one another. Since it was fought at such long range, the Italians didn't do any real damage to the British, in spite of straddling warspite at multiple points. Again, the accuracy issue isn't non-existent, but is still largely overplayed. The British, however, proved more accurate, or more lucky, depending on your point of view. A shell from warspite hit Cesare in her funnel, one of the longest range hits on a moving ship in history. It did only minor damage in the grand scheme of things, but it did succeed in temporarily slowing the Italian battleship down. This, and confusion about the extent of the damage, led the Italians to break off, with Cavour doing fairly minimal work in that particular battle. Which is a shame, because that was her only battle at sea. The following months were spent repairing damage and working up the other Italian battleships. Cavour would take part in several other attempts at British convoys, though she would see no major action. This continued all the way through the end of 1940, until a fateful night in November. November 11th, to be precise, when the British attacked Taranto with their Swordfish bombers. This attack did a number on multiple Italian battleships, but Cavour arguably came out the worst. Not because of damage done in the attack, though, which was admittedly far more severe than one torpedo would indicate. No, there was another problem here. The issue came in that her captain was overruled by the admiral in command of the 5th Battleship Division. Instead of being allowed to beach Cavour on a nearby and shallow sandbank, she wasn't allowed to move until it was well too late, and she sank, instead, up to the turrets in much deeper waters. This move was initially an even keel sinking into an 11.5 degree list. Couple this with Cavour being the oldest and least valuable of the damaged battleships, she ended up having the lowest priority for salvage. Eventually, she would be raised up, much as her sister Da Vinci had been, by an intense amount of work. Her holes were patched, her guns and superstructure cut out or outright removed, and water pumped out. It would only be July 9th, 1941, that she was refloated, though, and she wouldn't reach Trieste for proper repairs until December 22nd. End result? She was out of service for the rest of the war. Her guns weren't operational again until September 1942. Replacing her entire electrical system took even longer. Further, she was intended to undergo another massive refit. In a reflection of the threat of air power, Cavour was intended to have her entire secondary battery replaced. She was going to be about as close to an anti-aircraft battleship as the Italians could muster, mounting a dozen 5.3-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mounts, along with 12 2.6-inch and 23 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Towards the end of this process, there was some desire to use 90mm guns in place of some of the 2.6-inch weapons. All of this wouldn't come to pass. For the same reason that Impero was never completed, Italian energies were placed towards lighter ships, and then with the armistice, cancelled entirely. The Germans captured the mid-reef at Cavour on September 8th, but made no efforts to complete the work. Instead, the battleship would be sunk in air raids in February 1945, capsizing on the 23rd. While she was refloated again after the war, that would only be for towing off for scrapping. Cavour, having only seen one major surface action, was scrapped in 1946. Too bad, considering her pair of extensive rebuilds. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.